Before we start, tell me where you are listening from in the comments. Maybe you are someone who believes that wealthy people are too attached to their material possessions to ever give them up. Maybe you think that successful people define themselves by what they own, rather than what they contribute. Maybe you have never experienced a moment when owning things started to feel like being owned by them, and how liberating it can be to discover what you actually need versus what you think you want. This conversation is for you. I want to tell you about the day I decided to sell almost everything I owned. Not because I was broke or facing financial crisis, but because I realized that my possessions were possessing me in ways that were preventing me from focusing on the work that actually mattered. A decision that confused my friends, concerned my family, and challenged everything I thought I knew about success and security. This was not about minimalism as a lifestyle trend or philosophical stance about materialism. This was about recognizing that the time and mental energy I was spending on managing, maintaining, and thinking about my possessions was time and energy that could be better spent on solving problems that could affect the future of human civilization. Today, I want to share this story because I believe many people are trapped by their own success, surrounded by possessions that were supposed to provide freedom and happiness, but actually create stress, distraction, and obligation. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is not acquiring more, but letting go of what you already have. But I also want to tell you about the one thing I could not bring myself to sell, the one possession that meant more to me than any house or car or piece of art. Something so personal and meaningful that it helped me understand the difference between owning things and being owned by them, between possessions that serve your purpose and possessions that distract from it. This decision forced me to confront questions about what I actually needed to be happy and productive, what role material possessions should play in a meaningful life, and whether accumulating wealth and objects was helping or hindering my ability to accomplish the goals that really mattered to me. The process of selling everything taught me lessons about attachment, identity, and freedom that I could not have learned any other way. It showed me that some of the things I thought I needed were actually burdens I had been carrying unnecessarily, and that the fear of not having enough was often more problematic than actually having less. It was May 20th, 2020, during the early months of the COVID pandemic, when the world seemed to be reevaluating everything about how we live, work, and spend our time. I was sitting in my Bel Air mansion, a $47 million property with 7 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, a tennis court, a swimming pool, and a wine cellar that I had visited maybe 3 times since buying the house. The irony was not lost on me that I was surrounded by more space and luxury than most people could imagine, but I felt more constrained and distracted than I had ever felt in my life. Every room contained possessions that required decisions, maintenance, or attention. Every beautiful object reminded me of time I had spent shopping, researching, or thinking about acquiring things instead of solving problems. I had multiple houses in different locations, dozens of cars, including several that I had not driven in years, art collections that I rarely looked at, and technological gadgets that had seemed essential when I bought them, but were now obsolete or forgotten in drawers and closets. The pandemic had forced everyone to spend more time at home, which made me acutely aware of how much stuff I had accumulated and how little of it actually contributed to my happiness, productivity, or sense of purpose. I was living in spaces filled with objects that were supposed to represent success, but that actually felt like evidence of distraction from more important work. But the moment that crystallized my decision to sell everything came during a video call with the SpaceX team about our progress toward the first crewed mission to the International Space Station. We were discussing weight restrictions and the careful calculations required to determine what equipment and supplies were absolutely essential for the mission versus what was merely convenient or comfortable. Every ounce on that spacecraft had to be justified in terms of necessity and contribution to mission success. Every object had to serve a clear purpose that outweighed the cost and complexity of including it. The astronauts would be living for months with only the possessions that were truly needed for survival and work. As I listened to this conversation while sitting in a room filled with expensive objects that served no clear purpose in my life, I realized that I was carrying far more unnecessary weight than any spacecraft. that my possessions had become drag on my mission rather than tools that helped me accomplish it. I started thinking about how much time I spent each week dealing with possession-related decisions and obligations. Scheduling maintenance for houses and cars, reviewing insurance policies, managing household staff, deciding where to store things I rarely used, and coordinating logistics for properties in multiple locations. I calculated that I was spending at least 10 hours per week on possession management activities that added no value to my work or happiness, but that consumed mental energy and attention that could have been directed toward more important problems. I also realized that my possessions were creating psychological pressure in ways I had not fully recognized. Every object I owned represented a choice I had made, a decision I might need to revisit, a responsibility I had accepted. The cumulative weight of these small obligations was creating stress and decision fatigue that was affecting my ability to focus on the challenges that really mattered. That evening, I made a decision that seemed radical even to me. I would sell almost everything I owned and live with only the possessions that directly contributed to my work or genuinely enhanced my life. I would eliminate the drag of unnecessary ownership and redirect the time and energy I was spending on possession management towards solving problems that could benefit humanity. The process of deciding what to sell and what to keep forced me to examine my relationship with material objects in ways I had never done before. I had to ask myself hard questions about why I had acquired certain things, whether they were serving their intended purposes, and what I was afraid would happen if I no longer owned them. Most of my possessions, I realized, had been acquired not because I needed them, but because I thought successful people were supposed to own them. Houses in prestigious locations, cars that demonstrated technological sophistication, art that showed cultural sophistication, gadgets that represented cutting-edge innovation. But when I honestly evaluated how these possessions affected my daily life, I had to admit that most of them created more burden than benefit. They required maintenance, security, insurance, and management that consumed resources without providing corresponding value. I started with the obvious excess: houses I rarely used, cars I never drove, gadgets I'd forgotten about. But as the process continued, I found myself questioning possessions that I had considered essential. Did I really need a house with 13 bathrooms? Did owning multiple properties actually make my life better or just more complicated? The sales process took over a year to complete. I worked with real estate agents, auction houses, and private buyers to find new homes for possessions that had once seemed important, but that I was discovering I could live without. Each sale was an experiment in letting go. I would sell something, wait to see if I missed it or needed it, and almost invariably discover that I felt lighter and more focused rather than deprived or regretful. The houses were the most significant decisions. Selling the Bel Air mansion meant giving up a symbol of success that I had worked years to afford, but it also meant eliminating the time and mental energy I spent thinking about property taxes, maintenance schedules, security systems, and all the other complexities that come with owning expensive real estate. The cars were easier to release because I realized that I had been collecting them more as objects of appreciation than as tools for transportation. Most of them sat in garages, while I used the same few vehicles for my actual driving needs. The art and collectibles were somewhere in between. Some pieces had genuine personal meaning, but many had been acquired as investments or status symbols rather than for aesthetic or emotional value. But throughout this process, there was one possession that I could not bring myself to sell, one object that felt different from all the others in ways that helped me understand what ownership should actually mean. It was a guitar, not an expensive vintage instrument or a collectible that represented financial value, but a simple acoustic guitar that I had bought 15 years earlier during one of the most stressful periods of building Tesla and SpaceX. I had purchased it almost impulsively during a brief break between 18-hour workdays, thinking that learning to play music might provide a different kind of mental stimulation and stress relief than the constant problem-solving that consumed most of my thinking. I was not naturally musical, and I had very little time to practice, but something about the physical act of creating sounds with my hands, the mental challenge of learning chord progressions, and the emotional release of playing simple melodies had become important to my psychological well-being in ways I had not anticipated. Unlike my other possessions, which I had acquired and then largely forgotten about, the guitar was something I actually used regularly, not expertly or publicly, but consistently and meaningfully as a tool for mental reset and creative expression that was completely different from my work activities. When I picked up the guitar after long days of thinking about rocket engineering or battery technology, my mind would shift into a different mode that was both relaxing and stimulating. The focus required to coordinate my fingers with musical patterns gave my analytical mind a break while engaging creative capacities that were not utilized in business or technical work. The guitar had also become associated with some of my clearest thinking about difficult problems. There was something about the combination of physical activity, creative expression, and mental relaxation that often led to insights about challenges I had been struggling with in my professional work. I had solved engineering problems while playing simple chord progressions, developed business strategies while practicing scales, and gained perspective on personal relationships while working through melodies that expressed emotions I had difficulty articulating in words. But more than its practical utility, the guitar represented something about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of life I wanted to live. It reminded me that achievement and contribution were important, but so were beauty, creativity, and the simple pleasure of making something with your hands. When I considered selling the guitar along with everything else, I realized that it was not just an object but a practice, a connection to parts of myself that were not defined by business success or technological innovation. It was one of the few possessions that actually added value to my life rather than complexity. The guitar also helped me understand the difference between owning things and being owned by them. My houses and cars and gadgets had owned me in the sense that they required constant attention, decision-making, and resource allocation. But the guitar was something I truly owned because it served my purposes without creating obligations or distractions. This distinction became a filter for evaluating which possessions were worth keeping and which were worth releasing. Objects that served clear purposes and enhanced my life without creating excessive demands could stay. Objects that existed primarily as symbols, investments, or evidence of success could go. The process of selling almost everything I owned was surprisingly liberating. Each possession I released felt like removing weight I had not realized I was carrying. The mental space that had been occupied by possession management became available for more important thinking and decision-making. I discovered that I had been operating under unconscious assumptions about what successful people were supposed to own and how wealth should be displayed. Releasing those assumptions allowed me to make decisions based on actual utility and personal meaning rather than external expectations or social signaling. The financial proceeds from the sales were reinvested in Tesla and SpaceX, funding research and development that could contribute to sustainable transportation and space exploration rather than sitting in the form of unused houses and cars that benefited no one. But the more important benefit was psychological. Living with fewer possessions meant making fewer possession-related decisions, spending less time on possession management, and having more mental bandwidth available for the work that actually mattered to me. I moved into a smaller rented house near the SpaceX facility in Texas, a decision that seemed incomprehensible to people who could not understand why someone would choose to rent when they could afford to buy, or why anyone would downsize when they had the resources to live in luxury. But the rented house provided everything I actually needed: space to work, privacy for family time, and proximity to my most important professional activities. It eliminated the maintenance, insurance, property taxes, and management complexity that had been consuming time and attention without providing corresponding benefits. The guitar came with me to the new house, where it sits in my home office as a reminder of the difference between possessions that serve your purpose and possessions that distract from it. It represents the principle that ownership should be intentional rather than automatic, meaningful rather than symbolic. Playing the guitar still provides the same mental reset and creative stimulation that it did 15 years ago. The difference is that now it exists in a context of intentional simplicity rather than unconscious accumulation. It is not competing for attention with dozens of other objects, but is valued for what it actually contributes to my life. The decision to sell almost everything also influenced how I think about acquisition going forward. Before making any significant purchase, I ask myself questions that I never asked before. Does this object serve a clear purpose that cannot be served by something I already own? Will owning this thing require time and attention that could be better spent on more important activities? Am I buying this because I need it or because I think successful people are supposed to own it? These questions have prevented me from reaccumulating possessions that would have recreated the same problems I solved by selling everything in the first place. They have helped me maintain the psychological and practical benefits of living with intentional simplicity. The experience also changed my understanding of wealth and what it means to use financial resources effectively. I realized that accumulating possessions was often a form of waste rather than enjoyment, a way of converting money into burdens rather than benefits, using wealth to fund research and development, to support important causes, or to create opportunities for other people felt more satisfying and meaningful than using it to acquire objects that would sit unused in houses I rarely visited. 3 years after selling almost everything, I still live in the same small rented house with the same simple acoustic guitar. I have not missed any of the possessions I sold, but I have benefited enormously from the time and mental energy that possession management had been consuming. The guitar reminds me daily that the goal is not to own nothing, but to own things intentionally, to distinguish between possessions that serve your purpose and possessions that own you. To understand that accumulation is not the same as accomplishment, and that simplicity can be more sophisticated than complexity. People often ask if I regret selling everything or if I plan to reaccumulate possessions now that the initial experiment is complete. But the question misses the point of what I learned from the process. The value was not in proving that I could live without things, but in discovering what I actually needed versus what I thought I wanted. In recognizing how much energy I had been spending on possession management that could be better directed toward more important work, the guitar represents the principle that guided the entire process. Keep what serves your purpose, release what distracts from it, and make ownership decisions consciously rather than automatically. I sold all my possessions except this one thing, because it taught me the difference between having things and being had by them. Because it showed me that the most valuable possessions are those that enhance your capabilities rather than consume your attention. Because sometimes the most radical thing a successful person can do is not acquiring more, but letting go of what no longer serves their actual needs and purposes. If you are someone who feels overwhelmed by your possessions, who spends significant time on ownership-related obligations, or who suspects that some of your things might be owning you more than you are owning them, I want you to know that simplification is possible even from positions of abundance. The question is not whether you should sell everything, but whether you are making ownership decisions consciously and whether your possessions are serving your purposes or distracting from them. Sometimes the things we think we need are actually weights we are carrying unnecessarily. Share this with someone who might need to examine their relationship with their possessions and consider whether simplification could create more freedom than accumulation. Subscribe if these conversations help you think about the relationship between ownership